The combat of Genshin Impact revolves around elemental reactions. You could look up a guide that explains the reactions and then just throw a team together and hope you trigger them, but if you want to build a truly good team, it's a little more complicated than that. In this video, I'm going to go through all the different team combinations that players have come up with to get the most out of reactions and help you get the most fun out of Genshin Impact combat. If I mention a concept you're unfamiliar with, there's a good chance I covered it in my previous video. I'll try to give you all the context you need in this video, so don't feel like you have to watch that one first. But of course I'd appreciate it if you watch it after. First up, Hypercarry. Starting with this one will allow me to explain a lot of basics that apply to every other team. In a Hypercarry team, your on-field DPS character, or carry, is responsible for all of the damage, and the other three characters are all supports, off-fielders who are there to give your carry the biggest buffs possible. Contrary to what I said at the start, Hypercarries don't care about reactions. They just care about making one character deal the most DPS possible, though some specific carries have unique mechanics that will encourage reactions anyway, but we'll get to that. I went in depth into various types of buffs in the previous video, so for now I'll just say that the three most important buffs to look for are Res Reduction or Res Shred, which reduces how much an enemy will resist your damage, Damage Bonus, which increases your damage of the appropriate type, and buffs to your character's scaling stat, which will usually be attack, but often might be max HP, and in a handful of cases either defense or elemental mastery. When to build a Hypercarry team mostly just depends on what characters you have. Physical, Anemo, and Geo carries don't have access to high damage reactions, so they'll usually be in a Hypercarry or a mono element team. But if you want the most out of a Pyro, Hydro, or Cryo carry, two of the strongest bonuses are Vaporize and Melt reactions. Cryo carries also might be significantly more effective in a freeze team. Dendro carries heavily depend on reactions, and the same could be said for Electro as well. So unless there's another reason why a carry of one of those elements wouldn't work well in a reaction team, you might want to play them in one of the other teams I'm going to mention later in the video. In any case, a good carry needs to deal a lot of damage while they are on field. Ideally, they'll have an Ascension stat that buffs their damage. It will probably be a 5-star character because they have higher stat scalings than 4 stars, and every character that ascends with crit rate or crit damage, the two most valuable DPS stats, is 5 stars. Ultimately, determining who is a good carry could be an entire video on its own, so I'll just say that most characters get their value from their skill and burst talents, as well as their passive talents unlocked at Ascension Phase 1 and 4. Some constellations can also change a character's role. So if a character's talents provide the team with a buff or deal damage over time while they are off-field, then they are probably meant to just be off-field. Otherwise, if their talents only work for themselves while they are on-field, they are probably meant to be a carry. Whether they're actually a good carry or not is a separate discussion. For your weapon, something with crit rate or crit damage will usually be the best if you have one. Otherwise, your character's scaling stat is the next best thing, or possibly energy recharge if your carry has high energy requirements. But in that case, teammates with Fav or some other form of battery would be better than making your carry build extra energy recharge, but sometimes you take what you can get. If your carry scales with attack, then a weapon with higher base attack and less secondary stat could be better. Try to get a weapon passive that grants additional buffs that your carry can use. There are plenty of free-to-play accessible weapons like 3 stars and forgeable ones, so don't feel like you have to wish on the weapon banner to get a good one. Artifact sets for hypercarries will vary quite a bit, as many dedicated carries in the game have an artifact set made for them, but some that can be used on multiple carries include Marechese Hunter, which is a great set for any carry on a team with Farina, or a carry with their own mechanic that makes their HP go up and down, Obsidian Codex, which is best in slot for pretty much any Natlan carry, Emblem of Severed Fate, which could be good for a carry that deals most of their damage with their elemental burst and needs a lot of energy recharge to cast it, and Wanderer's Troop or Gladiator's Finale, which are usable by most ranged or melee characters respectively, though in most cases they are just placeholder sets until you get one that's better. Also, I want to mention Night of the Sky's Unveiling here, even though it's not a Hypercarry artifact set, but it just came out so I didn't get to mention it in my last video. It will be good for carries in Lunar Reaction teams, which I'll touch on at the end of the video. The team doesn't rely on elemental reactions, so you shouldn't need to build any elemental mastery on your gear, since all that does is increase the damage of reactions. As such, your off-fielders also don't need to worry about applying elements to enemies. There can be exceptions in cases where buffs are activated by triggering a reaction, such as a support using Viridescent Venerer or Scroll of the Hero of Cinder City, so in those cases you will need to plan to activate those buffs before you start dealing any damage on your carry. As for the gear to use on off-fielders, there's a number of artifact sets that are common among all teams, like the two I just mentioned, plus Noblesse Oblige, Tenacity of the Millilith, and so on, which I detailed in the previous video. For weapons, the easy go-to is Fav if you can't think of anything else, because pretty much every team needs energy. Otherwise, if you have a weapon that boosts your carry's damage, that's good, or even just the character's own damage. Your off-fielders could still be damage dealers, also called sub-DPS, but their damage is just an added bonus in Hypercarry teams, and their main purpose is the buffs they provide. At this point, I wanted to get into some example teams, but when I had those written into the script, it was is over an hour long. Plus, I don't own all the characters I'd need. So instead, I will keep it simple and put all the information into these overlays. The rotation for any Hypercarry team is pretty similar. Activate all your buffs on your supports, then swap to your carry and start dealing damage. Supports with the longest lasting buffs should be first, and any support with TTDS must be last. To activate VV or Cinder City, apply your carry's element and then swap to the one with those artifacts. VV doesn't last very long, so you might need to trigger it twice per rotation if possible. Hopefully, when your buffs start wearing off and your carry stops dealing big damage, your support's abilities will be ready to use again, so you can start the rotation again from the top. Otherwise, if they aren't charged up yet, you might need some more energy recharge or battery supports. If they are still on cooldown, then you might need to use a different support whose cooldowns fit better, or tweak the rotation to last longer. Most of this applies to every other team too, not just Hypercarry. Lastly, I want to mention what is more like the inverse of a Hypercarry team. People call it a wheelchair team, and it's when your 3 off-fielders are so strong that it doesn't even matter who the carry is. The team will still deal tons of damage. There are only a few combinations of characters that are this strong, so I can't really call it an archetype. That said, depending on which combination and which carry you choose, you might actually be playing a reaction team, in which case it's really not similar to Hypercarry at all. Next up, let's talk mono-element teams, which are similar in that they don't care about reactions. Where a Hypercarry team relies on one character for nearly all the damage, mono-element relies on a single element for all the damage. So there can be some crossover. Usually you have 3 characters of one element and a 4th who best supports the team regardless of their element. We often refer to this 4th character as the flex slot because they aren't really part of the core team, so they make the team more flexible by letting you pick whatever character is most useful in your current situation. One of the main advantages to a mono-element team is that all of your characters will benefit more from each other's elemental particles, making your energy recharge requirements lower than a reaction team, at least in theory. And since you don't need any elemental mastery, that means you can focus more on the DPS stats. Much of what I said for Hypercarry remains true for mono-element. For mono, Pyro, Hydro, Electro, or Cryo, the team building is pretty straightforward, and your flex will probably be an Anemo character with VV or Xianyun because those are the most common sources of res shred, assuming you don't already have some of it. As for artifact sets, all those ones I mentioned for Hypercarry will work. In addition to those, Thunder Soother is fine for mono Electro DPS, and Lava Walker is fine for mono Pyro DPS. Blizzard Strayer is fine for mono Cryo DPS, though you miss out on 20% crit rate without freeze. For mono Hydro, hopefully you have Farina, which means Marashosei Hunter will be the best carry set. Otherwise, you could look at Heart of Depth or Nymph's Dream. For any of those teams, you could also have your 3 mono element characters all be off-fielders, while the flex is your on-fielder, and more of a driver than a carry. While these mono element teams can be perfectly fine, you might be better off adding another element to form a reaction team, depending on what characters you have available. The main use cases are when an enemy has a particular weakness to an element, or when an enemy has a permanent aura that prevents most reactions and allows you to trigger specific reactions without having that element on your team. However, then you can't normally trigger VV or Cinder City since you can't have a Pyro aura, but I'll get into that at the end. Mono Geo is a little different because the only Geo reaction is Crystallize, which doesn't deal damage. Then, when it comes to the flex slot, VV can't buff Geo, and Xianyun doesn't work if there's 3 or 4 Geo characters on the team, unless you have Urtzi too. So that cuts out 2 common options for a flex. When deciding, don't forget that in order to benefit from Geo resonance, you have to have a shield. So if none of your Geo characters is a shielder, you will need your flex to be a shielder, or be Pyro, Hydro, Electro, or Cryo, so that you can trigger Crystallize reactions. For artifact sets, Husk of Opulent Dreams and Nighttime Whispers in the Echoing Woods are both good, depending on whether you want defense or attack. Mono Geo is basically defined by one character, and that's C6 Goro. Without Goro, there is no reason to put 3 Geo characters on the team, and without his C6, he is significantly weaker. And the only reason you'd want to play Goro in the first place is if your damage dealers scale with defense, and there are only 4 of those in the game. Mono Anemo we touched on briefly when I mentioned Wanderer Hypercarry or Xiao Hypercarry, but no one really calls it Mono Anemo because you're probably playing one of those 2 carries, and your supports being Anemo is just incidental. For artifacts, you've got the standard Hypercarry ones, plus Desert Pavilion Chronicle for Wanderer, and Vermilion Hereafter for Xiao. Though if you're using Farina as your flex, Marashosei Hunter is probably better than both. Mono Dendro is not a real thing, because the best thing you can do for any team with 3 Dendro characters is put an Electro character on it, and now you're playing a Quicken reaction team, not Mono Dendro. With the other Mono Element teams, I merely suggested that you might be better off converting them to reaction teams, but with Mono Dendro, I am stating unequivocally that is the case. Dendro was designed to be used in reaction-focused teams more so than any other element, as you can see from Dendro Resonance, plus the fact that most sources of Dendro damage scale with elemental mastery. any other team is going to be focused around one or more reactions. Before we start, let's quickly explain internal cooldown, or ICD, because understanding how it works is critical to building a reaction team. Basically, when you first hit an enemy with an element, you will apply the element, which means you will either put an aura of that element on them or react with an existing aura. But subsequent hits from the same character with the same type of attack to the same enemy won't always apply the element. For standard ICD, you will only apply an element once every 3 hits, and that counter resets 2.5 seconds after it starts. But certain characters have non-standard ICD, or no ICD at all, and we'll get into a few of those in the upcoming sections. First, let's talk about a non-damaging reaction, Freeze. When you apply Hydro and Cryo to an enemy, you trigger Frozen, and those auras will be replaced with a Freeze aura. While the Freeze aura lasts, most enemies will be, well, frozen, which means they can't attack you, can't wander around, and generally can't be knocked around by your abilities, though they can be grouped with suction effects. While the enemy is frozen, you can still apply Hydro or Cryo even though the game won't show it, and if you apply both, you can re-trigger Frozen to prolong the Freeze aura. However, there is a soft cap to the Freeze aura duration, so the enemies won't stay frozen indefinitely, but if your elemental application is consistent enough, you can just keep re-triggering Frozen to freeze them again. Generally, you will have a Cryo carry who deals consistent Cryo damage and wears the Blizzard Strayer artifact set for the hefty crit rate bonus, so you just need to make sure your off-field Hydro application is consistent so you can get that Freeze aura reapplied. Freeze does have some caveats though. First and foremost, several enemies are either resistant to it or straight up immune. All bosses, for example, are immune to Freeze. The biggest loss there is that 20% of the crit rate bonus from Blizzard Strayer requires enemies to be frozen, so you won't have that against bosses or the other enemies, making Freeze teams less desirable. On top of that, Frozen will still trigger, but end instantly, consuming both of your auras in the process, so you will frequently lose the other 20% crit rate as well as Cryo Resonance, since the enemy won't even have a Cryo aura when this happens. Losing that, as well as the Frozen effect itself, removes most of the benefit of using Freeze, so you're better off not playing it at all if the enemies can't be frozen. Then when it comes to Freeze resistance, what that does is reduce the duration of the Freeze aura, so against those enemies, your elemental application will have to be even more frequent in order to keep freezing them again after it wears off. If your application isn't frequent enough to do that, then again, Freeze loses its benefits. Second, it's easy to accidentally end your Freeze aura by causing a reaction. Geo application, as well as blunt damage, will trigger Shatter, ending the Freeze aura. Outside of that, the Freeze aura is treated as a Cryo aura for reactions, so any element besides Hydro that reacts with Cryo can potentially react with the Freeze aura and end it. So you'll need to be careful with your flex slot to make sure you don't run into this problem. When it comes to gearing, similar to the previous teams, you don't need Elemental Mastery because Frozen deals no damage, but you also don't need nearly as much crit rate because you should be taking advantage of Cryo Resonance and Blizzard Strayer, which is a free 55% crit rate against frozen enemies. A Freeze team should have 2 Cryo characters, including your carry, to enable Cryo Resonance. 1 Hydro with decent off-field application, and then a flex slot for either Res Shred, or if you already have a Escoffier, another Hydro or Cryo character. Farina is one of the best Hydro off-fielders, and if you play her, you'll need someone to be a healer. Escoffier can do that too. Basically, if you want to play Freeze, you should really get Escoffier. Alternatively, you could have your carry be Hydro, with Cryo coming from your off-fielders. Technically, a team like this still freezes enemies, but it doesn't really follow the conventions of a Freeze team that I laid out, but it still counts. Let's move on to damaging reactions, starting with additive reactions. There are only 2 additive reactions in the game at this time, Spread and Aggravate, which happen when you hit an enemy who has a Quicken aura with either Dendro or Electro, respectively. A Quicken aura is applied when Dendro and Electro react, and the best part, neither Aggravate nor Spread will remove the Quicken aura, so you can go wild with Electro and Dendro application even if you only have a little of the other. Collectively, all of these are called Catalyze. Generally, these teams will just consist of Dendro and Electro characters, though you can include any flex slot as long as their element doesn't interfere with your Quicken aura. If you have significantly more Electro application, you could call it an Aggravate team. Otherwise, for Dendro, you could call it a Spread team. But it's common to just call all of them Quicken teams because you'll probably be triggering both reactions quite a bit. For Quicken teams, you generally want your DPS to apply their element as much as possible, be level 90, and build a couple hundred elemental mastery, because the Quicken reactions will grant additive base damage to every single reacted hit, and the amount added is based on the triggering character's level and elemental mastery. But you also want high crit stats to increase that damage further, as well as damage bonus of the appropriate type. A decent amount of attack will also help if your DPS scales with attack, though that does not increase the damage from Quicken, and most characters need to use their elemental burst, so you'll want enough energy recharge to make that happen as well. As you can see, you want a lot of different stats on your DPS. For artifacts, Gilded Dreams is great for the EM bonus, and potentially the attack bonus as well. You will want someone on Deepwood Memories for the Dendro Res Shred, unless you are dedicating fully to Aggravate and don't plan on triggering much spread. In that case, you want Fischl on the team, because she is the queen of Aggravate, and Electro Reactions in general. Thundering Fury is also a good set for Electro DPS if you want to greatly increase how often you can cast their elemental skill, though some characters might have better specialized sets like Cloran does with Fragment of Harmonic Whimsy. On the flip side, if you are focusing more on spread with a Dendro DPS, then Fischl is less valuable because her A4 passive only procs when the on-field character triggers Electro Reactions, and spread is not an Electro Reaction. One thing you need to consider in your rotation for Aggravate is that for buffs like Cinder City and VV, you need to apply Electro first, which means either your carry will need to be able to do it, or you'll need to do a charged attack with Fischl to start your rotation. Alternatively, you could use her skill first, then burst at the end of your setup, depending on which option fits better into your rotation to give you the most uptime on your DPS characters. Remember that Fischl skills snapshots, as we covered in the previous video, so you want your buffs active before you cast it. Lastly, let's go over what happens when you include characters who are not Electro or Dendro. Quicken is treated as though it's a Dendro aura for the purpose of reactions, so it has no reaction with Anemo, Geo, or Cryo, so those three won't hurt your Quicken aura. As for Pyro, that will screw up your Quicken aura because it will react with it and create a burning aura. You will still have the Quicken aura as well until it burns away, but you can't refresh it or trigger it while there is a Pyro aura on the enemy. You can try to build a team to maintain both as much as possible, which is called Quickburn, but I wouldn't recommend it unless you are playing Emily. Either way, if you have a Pyro flex, you'll need high Electro application to get rid of the Pyro or burning auras and trigger or maintain your Quicken aura. Otherwise, if you just keep the burning aura, you'll be playing Burning Load or Overburn, which we'll talk about in the Overload section. Hydro, on the other hand, gets interesting, because it will react with Quicken to create a Dendro core, but it will usually leave the Quicken aura behind, because Hydro applied to any Dendro aura is technically a reverse reaction. We'll get more into that in the next section, but for now I'll just say that the order you apply elements in can change how much of the aura gets used up in the reaction. Anyway, these Dendro cores will allow you to trigger some Hyperblooms with your Electro character while still having full uptime on your Quicken aura. This is actually a variation of the Quicken team that we call Quickbloom. And the fact that Hydro and Electro both remain on the enemy when they react means that you don't have to worry too much about what order you apply them in. You just need to make sure that your Hydro application isn't too fast. If it's twice as fast as your Dendro application, then it will start consuming your Quicken aura and breaking the team. Lastly, let's circle back to Cryo. While Dendro and Cryo don't react, you do benefit from an unofficial interaction that we call Fridge. Because Hydro will prioritize the Cryo for reactions, your Cryo aura can actually protect your Dendro or Quicken aura from being consumed by the Bloom reaction when you're playing Quickbloom, because the newly applied element has to get through the Cryo aura first before it can start reacting with your Dendro or Quicken aura. This is more important for Hyperbloom teams, but I wanted to mention it now as a lead-in to Elemental Gauge Theory. I talked about it in the first video, but I'll go over it again now before moving on to the next set of reactions where it will be very important. Elemental Gauge Theory refers to the idea that when you apply an element to something, you are applying a certain amount of that element and respectively an aura of a certain durability or gauge, which we quantify in the form of gauge units. Most elemental attacks are 1 gauge unit, or 1U. When that 1U attack applies an aura to an enemy, it is also affected by aura tax, which reduces it to 80% of its gauge right off the bat. So a 1U attack applies an aura of 0.8U. Then if you hit an enemy who has that 0.8U with a different 1U attack for a reaction, because the attack has more gauge units than the aura, it is fully consumed by the reaction and leaves nothing behind. Otherwise, if you had first hit with a 2U attack, leaving a 1.6U aura, then hit with a different 1U attack for a reaction, the aura would still remain at a gauge of 0.6U, allowing you to react with it again. The gauge of any aura decays over time, and when it reaches 0U, that's when it disappears. However, amplifying reactions, as well as Bloom, as I mentioned earlier, will multiply the gauge units of the attack by either half or double, depending on which order you apply the elements in. So let's explain Fridge with all that in mind. You'll have a 0.8U Dendro aura with a 0.8U Cryo aura. When your 1U of Hydro hits, it first reacts with the Cryo aura to trigger Freeze, and they consume each other equally, leaving 0.2U of Hydro. This Hydro continues into the Dendro aura to trigger Bloom, consuming only half as much because it's a reverse reaction, leaving 0.7U Dendro. You can then apply 1U of Hydro again, consuming half as much Dendro to trigger Bloom again, leaving a 0.2U Dendro aura. You can then apply Hydro a third time, finally consuming all of the Dendro aura to trigger a total of 3 Blooms with a single 1U application of Dendro. So, long story short, the Cryo aura preserves the Dendro or Quicken aura against your Hydro application like a fridge preserves your food. Of course, it takes time to apply all those elements, during which the auras will decay, so the exact numbers will be off, but that's beside the point. So now let's get into amplifying reaction teams. The two amplifying reactions are Melt, which is Pyro and Cryo reacting, and Vaporize, which is Pyro and Hydro reacting. These reactions multiply the damage of the attack that caused the reaction. The amount of the increase depends on which element you apply first. Hydro being applied to a Pyro aura, and Pyro being applied to a Cryo aura are forward reactions, which consume up to twice as many gauge units of aura as the gauge units of your attack, and multiply the damage by 2. Pyro being applied to a Hydro aura, and Cryo being applied to a Pyro aura are reverse reactions, which only consume up to half as many gauge units of aura as the gauge units of your attack, and multiply the damage by 1.5. Because of the lower aura consumption, you can usually get 2 amplifying reactions out of a single aura if you are using a reverse reaction. The factor that you multiply your damage by is also increased by the elemental mastery of the character triggering the reaction, so you want a decent amount of elemental mastery on your main damage dealer triggering the reaction, usually around 300. For amplifying reaction teams, you generally only want to focus on one such reaction: forward Vaporize, forward Melt, reverse Vaporize, or reverse Melt. There is such a thing as a Vapemelt team, but we'll save that for later. For artifact sets on your carry, Gilded Dreams is always a good option for reaction teams because of the EM bonus. If your carry is Pyro, Crimson Witch of Flames could be better since it buffs Pyro damage and Pyro reactions, assuming you can activate its stacking bonus. And if you are playing Vaporize, you might also be using Farina, in which case Marechaussee Hunter is likely the best set. Once you've decided which amplifying reaction to use, you need to select a character with consistent off-field application of your aura element to ensure that the enemy always has said aura when you hit them with your strongest attacks on your carry. You could also do it the other way around, with your on-fielder providing the aura and an off-field DPS triggering the reactions. Or they could both be off-field, it just depends on the characters. Powerful buffs like Vivi and Cinder City will need to cause a reaction with your trigger element in order to buff it, so if you want those buffs, you will need to find a way to apply your trigger element's aura at least once for those reactions before starting the rest of your DPS rotation and applying the other element. And if you need to do more than one rotation, you'll need to do the same thing again. Maintaining the right aura is easier on a reverse reaction team because of the reduced aura consumption, so your aura's application could be weaker, or your trigger's application could be a bit stronger. For a forward reaction team though, you'll need to be careful and use a rotation to properly time your elemental application, because if you ever apply the wrong aura, the team will cease to function until you correct it. Now let's talk about some team variants. If you're playing Reverse Melt, you can also add Dendro to the team, which will react with the Pyro to create Burning, and we call this team Burnmelt. Burning reacts just like Pyro, and it always starts at 2U every time you apply it, so it's almost impossible to get rid of with Cryo application before it would wear off on its own, allowing you to melt even more of your Cryo hits. Reverse Vaporize also has something similar when you add Electro, forming a team we call Overvape. As we'll get into later, the Electro aura will coexist with your Hydro aura. Then, when you hit with Pyro to trigger Vaporize, you will actually trigger Overload and Vaporize. Lastly, let's revisit that Vapemelt team. If you have all 3 of these elements on the team, you can get some more consistent damage with your Pyro carry. Vapemelt is basically treated like a forward Melt team, but you have Hydro as a backup to occasionally give you reverse Vaporizes if your Cryo application isn't fast enough, and also help remove any Pyro aura so that the Cryo aura can actually be applied. And of course, if your Hydro and Cryo react, the enemies get frozen, which is nice for the reasons we already covered in the freeze section, and you can trigger Melt with it. However, there are 2 things you need to factor in for Vapemelt. First is if your Pyro carry deals blunt damage, you will trigger Shatter on a frozen enemy instead of Melt. If you can reliably apply Cryo or Hydro in addition to the Freeze Aura, then you can trigger Melt or Vaporize, but otherwise your team doesn't function. Second, if the enemies can't be frozen, then when Hydro and Cryo react, they will just do nothing and leave no aura behind for your Pyro to react with. Before we move on, let's talk about Xianyun. Xianyun enables a new playstyle with her Elemental Burst by giving every character the ability to jump high and then plunge attack. Plunging attacks are strong, and she makes them even stronger. Plus, they have no ICD assuming they deal elemental damage. That makes plunging attacks work great for carries in amplifying reaction teams, if you can deal Pyro, Hydro, or Cryo damage. For Catalyst carries, you're good to go, but bow carries are out of luck here. When it comes to Claymores, Polearms, and Swords, though, you can infuse your weapon with one of those elements using a specific support. C6 Bennett for Pyro, Candace for Hydro, or Chongyun for Cryo, with Bennett's buffs making him the best of the three. With that, you can build the amplifying reaction team of your choice, and you'll be triggering a reaction on every plunge, as long as your off-field application can keep up. Just don't try to play Vapemelt, because plunging attacks are blunt damage. Before we get into transformative reaction teams, let's mention one more advanced game mechanic known as damage sequence, because it will impact the DPS of some of these teams. In short, it's a mechanic in the game designed to prevent rapid hits from dealing too much damage, by reducing the damage of each subsequent hit within a given short time frame. In the context of the teams we're about to discuss, it puts a limit on how many times an enemy can take damage from a type of transformative reaction in the span of half a second. So, for example, if you have 5 Dendro cores on the ground, and Hyperbloom all 5 of them at once at a single enemy, only 2 of them will deal damage, because the damage sequence of Hyperbloom limits it to 2 instances of damage per half second. Similarly, if you stack a bunch of enemies on top of each other and trigger Overloaded on all of them at once with AoE elemental application, all of them will only be damaged by a single overload, because that's limited to 1 per half second. Now then, transformative reactions add an entirely separate instance of damage when you trigger a reaction, rather than adding to the damage of your hit like additive reactions, or multiplying it like amplifying reactions. Each transformative reaction is unique, and each one's damage will start with a different base damage multiplier. The thing that they share in common is how their damage is calculated from there. The base damage is increased solely by the triggering character's level and elemental mastery, and reduced by the enemy's resistance to the element of the damage. If you have a buff that specifically names a reaction and says it grants it a bonus, that increases the damage as well, but nothing else. Not damage bonuses, crits, or enemy defense. Character stat scalings and multipliers are irrelevant. All that matters is how they apply their element, because any 2 characters with equal level and elemental mastery will deal the same damage with any given transformative reaction, with few exceptions. With that in mind, a team built around a transformative reaction will need nothing but elemental mastery on the character triggering that reaction, and the character should be level 90. And when I say should be level 90, the increase from level 80 to 90 is about 34% more damage, so I mean it. They may need some energy recharge if they rely on their elemental burst to trigger the reactions, but hopefully it doesn't cut into their elemental mastery too much. Whether you should build a team around any given transformative reaction will depend on its base damage multiplier and how often you can actually trigger the reaction. So now let's go through all of them. Let's start with one that you don't actually build a team around. Shatter we mentioned in the freeze section because it's generally just a detrimental side effect to freeze teams, and is probably not something you ever want to do on purpose. All it does is some physical damage and then unfreeze the enemies. If you can freeze enemies consistently enough that you actually trigger Shatter enough times to deal non-negligible damage, then you should just be playing freeze. But if you insist, you'll need your Geo or blunt damage dealer built as a reaction trigger with full EM and level 90. Superconduct happens with Electro and Cryo reacting, deals AoE Cryo damage without applying more Cryo, and reduces the physical res of the enemies in the AoE. That last point is usually the reason you'd want to trigger it, which only matters if you're playing a physical damage team. Trying to optimize for Superconduct damage itself will be rough because of the low damage multiplier, but you would build in a similar way to amplifying damage teams. As much application of one element as possible, with one character of the other element built to trigger all of the Superconducts. Since Superconduct is Cryo damage, you'll want Cryo Res Shred on the enemies as well. For that reason, my recommendation would be using a Cryo DPS with good application, and building your Electro character for Elemental Mastery. There's no forward or reverse Superconduct, so you don't have to worry about that. In most cases, you'd be better off replacing your Electro character with Hydro and playing Freeze, or with Pyro and playing Melt, because those reactions will add so much more value than the Superconduct damage, but there could be exceptions. Overloaded happens with Electro and Pyro reacting, deals AoE Pyro blunt damage without applying more Pyro, and causes significant knockback. Because of that last part, Overload teams are generally annoying to play because when enemies get knocked around, you stop being able to hit them all with smaller AoEs. But if you're fighting enemies that can't be knocked around, that downside goes away. Also, if you own Chevreuse, the buffs she provides to an Overload team consisting of only Pyro and Electro characters are so strong that the team will be good regardless. That said, you don't generally focus on the overloaded damage itself because of the wealth of strong Pyro and Electro DPS and supports, who'd rather focus on granting buffs and dealing damage normally. You'll want level 90 and some elemental mastery on any character who will trigger overloaded, but you generally won't have a dedicated trigger. I personally would not try to play an overload team without Chevreuse, but otherwise you'll want to get some res shred from somewhere else. Alternatively, you can add a Dendro character to trigger burning, since you'll be able to trigger more overloads on a burning aura than a Pyro aura. Or add a Hydro character, allowing you to trigger both overloaded and vaporize, which we talked about in the reverse vaporize section. Burning happens with Dendro and Pyro reacting and makes the enemy take Pyro damage over time briefly. It also deals this damage in a very small AoE, applies Pyro to any one hit, and it can hurt the player as well, so if you're in melee range with a burning enemy, your character can very easily be defeated from that alone, unless you have Emily on the team. The way the burning aura works is as soon as both elements are applied, a 2U burning aura is applied in addition to both other auras. As the burning damage ticks, the Dendro aura will be quickly consumed over a second or two, and the Pyro aura will be reapplied at 1U every 2 seconds to all enemies who take the damage. Once the Dendro is fully consumed, burning ends, leaving behind the Pyro aura. If you can extinguish the burning with another Pyro reaction, then you can potentially leave the Dendro aura behind. Burning counts as Pyro for elemental reactions, and any reaction will consume both burning and the underlying Pyro aura equally. Otherwise, you can keep applying Dendro to keep refreshing the duration of the burning aura and keep it ticking indefinitely. Note that refreshing a burning aura like this does not count as triggering a reaction, so it won't activate things like Nahida's skill or the Instructor artifact set. The burning damage is determined from the stats of whoever most recently applied Pyro or Dendro, since you need to constantly reapply Dendro to maintain burning and don't need to reapply Pyro at all. If you want a burning team, your Dendro character will likely be your dedicated trigger. But there are other ways you can utilize burning as well. First is if your team gains a buff from a burning aura, such as using Kinich, Emily, or the Unfinished Reverie artifact set. In those cases, you are using it for the buff, not because you care about its damage, so you don't build any character as a pure reaction trigger. Second is if you're playing Burnmelt or Burning Load, or any other team that wants the enemy to have a Pyro aura, some of which we mentioned earlier in the video. And all you care about there is that burning has higher gauge units and lasts longer than a Pyro aura alone, and thus can enable more reactions. So again, you don't build for the burning damage. Third is if you're fighting an enemy with a ward or some other mechanic that is countered by elemental damage or just Pyro damage, such as the Tenebrous Mimiflora enemies or the Lava Dragon statue. And once again, you only care that it ticks 4 times per second and not for its damage. Lastly, I guess we can mention Air Fryer, where you have Venti gather up all the enemies and set them on fire, and in this team, you do build for reaction damage, and Venti is your trigger for both burning and swirl because of how rapidly his burst hits. Now for a transformative reaction team that has its own name, Taser, which is centered around the Electro-Charged reaction. Electro-Charged happens with Hydro and Electro reacting, which leaves both auras on the target and deals electro damage to them once per second while both auras persist. The electro damage also hits any other character with a Hydro aura nearby. You can refresh the Electro-Charged duration by continuing to apply Hydro and Electro, and the damage is calculated based on the last character to apply either element. As a result, the ownership of the Electro-Charged damage will be almost impossible to keep track of because of the constant need to reapply both elements, so you might not have a dedicated trigger. So instead, you just build all of your characters for support and dealing damage normally, with some elemental mastery to help whenever they are the ones with Electro-Charged ownership. Lastly, because both Electro and Hydro are on the enemy, you can trigger reactions with both elements when you apply a third element. Let's talk about Swirl. Swirl happens when you apply Anemo to a Pyro, Hydro, Electro, or Cryo aura. There's no such thing as an Anemo aura, so it has to be that order, and the Anemo character is always the reaction trigger. The best thing about Swirl is the ability to activate VV for the huge res shred buff to the other characters on your team. But beyond that, when Swirl is triggered, it does AoE damage of the swirled element, spreading it to the other enemy's hit. And it's technically a reverse reaction, so it generally won't remove the original aura by itself. When it spreads, it can trigger chain reactions with that element, which use the stats of the one who triggered the swirl. And that is your goal when you play a Swirl team. In most cases, you are playing playing another kind of reaction team with an Anemo character, and that character is responsible for triggering all the reactions via chain reactions, so the other characters can focus on their own damage. A team called Soup was a popular form of this, using strong Pyro, Electro, and Hydro characters, then throwing in some Anemo to swirl them all together and look at all the pretty numbers. Either way, chain reactions only work in multi-target situations, so these teams are not so great against bosses. I also want to mention elemental absorption. Many Anemo characters have a persistent effect that can absorb an element and start dealing that element of damage instead of just Anemo. That said, sometimes there are multiple elements present, so there's a priority for which element will be absorbed first, and it's Pyro, Hydro, Electro, Cryo. For some reason, Lynette and Anemo Traveler are exceptions and move Cryo to the highest priority. With a careful rotation, you can take advantage of elemental absorption to use your Anemo character as an elemental applicator for one of the elements on your team that you want to apply more of. Now let's get into the Bloom reactions, starting with Bloom itself. Bloom happens with Hydro and Dendro reacting and generates a Dendro core on the ground. Similar to amplifying reactions, Bloom has forward and reverse variants. This has no effect on the damage calculation, so applying Hydro to a Dendro aura is always better, and you want enough Dendro application to ensure this is always what's happening. You'll probably need 2 Dendro characters on a Bloom team. But also remember Fridge, which I explained at the end of the Quicken section. If you have both a Dendro and Cryo aura, you can apply Hydro 3 times for 3 Dendro cores. No matter what variant of Bloom you are playing, you want someone on the team using Deepwood Memory's artifact set for Dendro Res Shred. If the Dendro cores explode on their own, whoever triggered Bloom to generate the Dendro core is the one whose stats are used to calculate its damage, so that character should have high elemental mastery and can use the Flower of Paradise Lost set. Now that said, on its own, Bloom should not be your goal. Leaving those Dendro cores on the ground to explode on their own is a waste because it doesn't deal too much damage and takes forever. You want to hit them with Electro or Pyro to trigger Hyperbloom or Burgeon respectively. That will make them deal more damage and deal it immediately. The exception would be Nilou. If you have only Dendro and Hydro characters on the team, Nilou's elemental skill will cause all subsequent Dendro cores to be Bountiful cores, which explode quickly and deal significantly more damage depending on her max HP. In almost all cases, you want 2 Dendro characters and 2 Hydro characters, so you get both elemental resonances. Obviously, one of those Hydro characters is Nilou, and the original best Dendro was Nahida because she has the highest Dendro application, but Lauma surpasses her because of Lunar Bloom. Either way, you just need as much application of both elements as possible, but preferably without letting your Hydro overtake your Dendro. You will also need a healer because the Bountiful cores will be dealing a lot of damage to you as well as the enemies, and your second Hydro character will pretty much be your Bloom trigger and built accordingly. Hyperbloom happens when you apply Electro to a Dendro core, which sends it flying towards the nearest enemy to deal Dendro damage. The damage is based on your Electro character's stats, so you build them as your trigger. Other than that, you just need sufficient Dendro and Hydro application to generate Dendro cores. Something to note about the 3 elements involved in this reaction is that they do not interfere with one another. While triggering Bloom is the goal, if you apply Electro and trigger either Electro-Charged or Quicken, neither of those will prevent you from triggering Bloom. You could also add in a Cryo character to benefit from the Fridge interaction, generating even more Dendro cores, and we call that team Hyperfridge. And just to complicate things, if you take advantage of elemental absorption to have an Anemo character trigger Hyperbloom with the absorbed Electro damage, or just through the Swirl AoE damage, people call that team Salad. So finally, we are at our last transformative reaction, Burgeon. Burgeon happens when you apply Pyro to a Dendro core and causes it to explode in an AoE of Dendro damage. Unlike with Hyperbloom, these 3 elements do not play nice together. If you hit your Dendro aura with Pyro first, you trigger Burning, and now you have to react it away, likely with forward Vaporize, before you can reach your Dendro aura with Hydro to trigger Bloom, which means you need 2 applications of Hydro in quick succession. Even though it's a forward reaction, Burning is always 2 U, so 1 U of Hydro is exactly enough to just remove it and won't result in a Bloom. So in order to generate sufficient Dendro cores, you need as little Pyro application as possible, but in order to Burgeon them, you need AoE Pyro damage. Right now, the best character for this is Toma. Unfortunately, his energy recharge requirements are so high that you can't build him full elemental mastery, but the team still works. Otherwise, there are some variants of the Burgeon team that can help you. Curry, which involves adding an Electro character to the team. Their purpose is to weaken the burning aura so that you can get through it and trigger Bloom with a single Hydro application. The higher their Electro electro application, the better they can get the job done. Ideally, they won't deal AoE electro damage so that they don't hit your Dendro cores. Otherwise, you're just playing Hyperbloom with a Pyro character, and just why? And as a bonus, they can add considerable damage to the team as an off-field DPS and overloaded enabler, since your Pyro character is already geared for reaction damage and should deal high overloaded damage. Then Sauté, which involves adding an Anemo character to the team. Similarly, they weaken the burning aura, but can also be your reaction trigger by triggering Pyro Swirl, which hits the Dendro cores, or by absorbing Pyro into one of their abilities. Or, much like with Hyperfridge, you can add a Cryo character. This will let you generate more Dendro cores through the Fridge interaction, but also weaken the burning aura so that you can get through it and trigger Bloom with a single Hydro application. In addition to that, Cryo will give you access to a few more reactions, and you can get 2 related team archetypes out of it, depending on how good your Hydro application is. Oven is when your Hydro application is high enough to vaporize the burning aura and trigger blooms without issue, and it will result in you triggering freeze on the enemies in addition to Burgeon. It's the Burgeon counterpart to Hyperfridge. Bain-marie is when your Hydro application is slow, and it's effectively a Burnmelt team where you occasionally trigger some Burgeons. It's like the Burnmelt counterpart to Quickbloom. Farina is the best Hydro for this team. Don't ask me about the food names. Theory crafters just love cooking and food. You know who else likes food?
Is it dinner time? Is it dinner time?
That's it for archetypes, so now let's talk about some advanced concepts or unique circumstances that can affect your teams. Let's start with self-application. A lot of characters can apply elements to themselves or other teammates. Some only apply the element for a split second, and we call that a cleanse because it can clear an aura that an enemy has placed on you. But it's very rare that that matters nowadays, except when you accidentally freeze yourself. So instead, let's focus on characters who constantly apply you with an element for the whole duration of their ability, starting with Bennett, who self-applies Pyro to anyone in his burst circle. A downside is that enemies can trigger reactions on you, like the Hydro Tulpa, who now does double damage via Vaporize if he hits you, so be careful. But on the plus side, you can also trigger reactions on yourself if you use another self-applicator, like Jean, who self-applies Anemo. With both of their bursts active, you will very rapidly trigger Pyro Swirl on yourself, which doesn't damage you, but does spread Pyro in an AoE around you at one of the fastest rates in the game, and if Jean is on field at the time, it also activates VV. This combo is called Sunfire. Some summons can also self-apply elements, like Zhongling's Guoba, who self-applies Pyro when he breathes fire. You can use Guoba's Pyro to swirl Pyro in situations where you can't do it on the enemies, which we'll get to later. However, only Sucrose's skill and Faruzan's charged attack can do it, for reasons no one knows, though some characters like Kazuha can use it to absorb the element. Another combo is Bennett and Razor, who self-applies Electro during his burst, allowing you to trigger Overloaded on yourself, which also only damages enemies and not you. This is one of the many components that go into the Thundering Furry team. Another component that is related to self-application is Elemental Infusion, granting your weapon an element. We already talked about how C6 Bennett does this in the Amplifying Reaction section, along with Chongyun and Candice. If you then do another Elemental Infusion that doesn't have the Cannot Be Overridden clause, you will trigger reactions on your weapon, and can have a similar effect as with self-application. Next, we kind of already talked about simultaneous reaction priority, in that I just stated what reactions will happen when specific combinations of auras are on the enemy. But in case you were wondering, the reason I knew all that is because all reactions have a known priority, so when you apply an element to any combination of auras, you can just go down the list to see what will happen. Some enemies can have permanent auras. This will drastically alter your team building when fighting that enemy, because unless another element aura can coexist with their permanent aura, you cannot have an aura of another element. And even if it can coexist, simultaneous reaction priority might still render your aura useless if the permanent aura takes priority, because your element application can never get through the permanent aura, though there are some exceptions. The environment can also apply auras to enemies, such as when it's raining or the enemies are standing in water, which apply a Hydro aura. Setting the ground on fire will also apply Pyro to anyone standing in it. You can react these away, but they will be reapplied almost immediately, so they will still affect your teams. In either case, it becomes extremely difficult or impossible to trigger effects like VV or Cinder City, because if you can't have the right aura on the enemy, then you can't react to trigger those buffs for the right element. A team with Zhongling and Sucrose can get around this by doing the aforementioned Goba Swirl. Certain Cinder City wielders might be able to get around it with weapon elemental infusion of the correct element, since they can then react using it. Otherwise, you might have to give up on some of those buffs and try to make up for the loss in other ways by taking further advantage of the permanent aura. Enemies can also have elemental wards. When the ward is broken, you fight them as normal, but before that, you can only drain the ward with elemental reactions, so you will need to have an element that reacts with the element of the ward. Then, in Natlan, they introduced void wards, which don't require reactions or elemental application, but rather elemental hits. That means ICD no longer matters against these wards, and you just need to hit them as much as possible with an element. Hits from characters in Nightsoul's Blessing state are tripled, giving Natlan characters an advantage. An important thing to note about wards, hitting a ward doesn't count as hitting the enemy, so effects that require you to hit, like Raiden Shogun's skill, or crit, like the Favonius weapons, will not proc. That will affect your team building if you're up against a boss with a ward. Then, in a similar vein, a lot of enemies have another meter called Fury or Rage, which isn't a ward, but it functions like the Void Ward, where each hit fills it up or reduces it, with the amount depending on the specific mechanics of each enemy. When the meter is filled, the enemy will change its mechanics in some way. Fury, wards, and permanent auras all have a big impact on team building and might make certain characters significantly better or significantly worse against those specific enemies. Finally, let's talk about regional mechanics. I don't mean the mechanics of a region, but rather special mechanics inherent to characters from a region. Fontaine started this with Arca, or Numa and Usia. Characters from Fontaine will be aligned with either Numa or Usia, and if they hit an enemy with the opposite alignment enough times with their Arca attack, the enemy will be stunned or hindered in some way. Most of the time, it's not important for team building because the benefit is never worth using a worse team just to utilize a certain Arca attack. Natlan then introduced Nightsoul. Natlan characters can enter a Nightsoul's Blessing state under some conditions, usually using their skill, and the state ends after a certain time or under some other conditions. The significance in team building is that some Natlan characters or gear depend on the Nightsoul's Blessing of other characters in order to fully utilize their own mechanics, most notably both of Natlan's artifact sets. This is why Obsidian Codex and Cinder City only fully work on Natlan characters. Then there's Nightsoul Burst. A Nightsoul Burst happens when any character deals elemental damage while a Natlan character is on the team. Its cooldown depends on how many Natlan characters are on the team. A Nightsoul Burst doesn't do anything on its own, but certain characters or gear from Natlan will have special mechanics that activate when a Nightsoul Burst is triggered. Most notably, Cinder City again, which only refunds energy to the wielder when Nightsoul Bursts are triggered. And most recently, we now have the Nodcry mechanic of Moonsign level. There are 2 levels of Moonsign, which activate when you have one Moonsign character or more than one Moonsign character. Level 1, Nascent Gleam, doesn't do anything on its own, but various Nodcry characters and gear will have effects that depend on it. At level 2, Ascendant Gleam, your team's lunar reaction damage is increased when non-Moonsign characters use elemental skills or bursts. That brings us to the other mechanic introduced in Nodcry, which is Lunar Reactions. In short, having a specific Nodcry character on your team will change a specific reaction into a lunar reaction. Lunar reactions tweak the reaction mechanics, which might alter your team building, both in the characters you want and in the stats you want on those characters. The team archetypes discussed in the video don't really change, you just get more options in building them. More importantly, these reaction changes all stem from having a specific character on your team. For that reason, in-depth discussion of lunar reactions is better left to specific character guides rather than a general team building guide like this. Alright, that wraps up all the things I can think to put in this guide. It should be relatively future-proof because as new characters come out, their best teams will likely be among these archetypes, so you just need to figure out which archetype benefits the character the most, or vice versa. There is more I could say on several of the points throughout the video, but it's already a bit too long. Plus, much of it was covered in the previous video. If anything requires further explanation, maybe it's best left to a future video, but that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and subscribe if you like what you see, because while it might take me forever to make videos, there is more to come.